Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. My name is Mike Brown. I'm in Toronto, Ontario, so it's the morning here, but recognizing that this is a global call, whatever the appropriate salutation is. Thank you for, firstly, thank you for joining the webinar, and thank you to Hans Martin and Peter and Akeem for organizing the series of webinars. I'm going to talk to you about my book called Strategic Airport Planning, and we're going to sort of cover a number of things in the book. And I've just labeled as a sort of enticement, pyramids, trilemmas, and inflections as some of the themes that I'm going to talk about today. So just reflecting back on the series of webinars we've had to date, we started with Marina Eftimio from DCU in Dublin, and she made the point that the air transportation system is in fact an ecosystem, and there are broadly three components to it. The vehicles, the aircraft, the air carriers, the way, air traffic control, and the terminals being airports, which is what my book is about. And arguably, every transportation system is made up of these three components. If you look at the Class 1 railroads in North America, like Canadian Pacific or Burlington Northern Santa Fe, they operate everything. They operate the vehicles, the trains, they operate the tracks, and the terminals. And there's a body of research that suggests that has in part contributed to their remarkable efficiency over the last number of years. In our business, with very few exceptions, the three parts of the ecosystem are operated by different organizations. And arguably, one of the themes of the webinars to date is the interface between the various parts of the ecosystem and how to manage that interface, which is sometimes the source of controversy. So in terms of regulation, in terms of partnerships, in terms of any number of ways we can think of to make the interfaces work better, I think is one of the common themes of the series of books that we've been talking about over the last few weeks. The other thing I think that is very instructive is to compare the capital intensity of the three parts of the ecosystem. What do I mean by capital intensity? It's a very simple measurement, and it's simply total assets divided by total revenue. And essentially what it is, it's a measure of how much capital has to be invested to earn $1, £1, €1 in revenue. And as you can see, there are big differentials in the capital intensity of the three components of the ecosystem, with airports having to invest substantially more in capital to earn a unit of revenue than the air carriers and air traffic control. So on the left-hand side, you have Canada, 2019. Toronto Pearson, the biggest airport in the country, has spent $4.30 in capital to earn $1 in revenue. Our National Air Traffic Control Company, NAV Canada, $1.60. Air Canada, our major air carrier, $1.50. And then on the right-hand side, the same numbers for the UK, Manchester Airport, NATS, and EasyJet. So I think this illustrates two things. One is that conversations between parts of the ecosystem about capital can sometimes be like men are from Mars and women are from Venus, because capital is clearly a far more important part of an airport's business model than it is for air carriers and air traffic control companies. Arguably, the air carrier business is really a fuel and labor business. Air traffic control is largely a human capital business with a little bit of IT and some air traffic control towers. And of course, this is also why airports spend a lot of time doing long-term planning, because of the capital intensity of the business. So I think this is an interesting sort of lens on the three parts of the ecosystem and some of the tensions between those parts of the ecosystem. The other thing I talk about in the book is that not only are airports very capital intensive, but there are some unique features about airport capital, what I call the 6 I's of airport capital. So it's indefinite. I mean, with the appropriate care and nurturing, a runway and a terminal building will last pretty much forever. It's immovable. Very difficult to relocate a terminal building to a growing market. If Ryanair sees the demand for travel between Scandinavia and Italy growing more rapidly than between the UK and Spain, it just moves aircraft to the growing market from the slower growth market. Airport capital is generally indivisible. It's very difficult to build a modular runway. You can build terminal buildings in modules, but they tend to be lumpy. Whereas for an air carrier, they just put on a bigger plane or offer more flights. It's intractable, very few alternative uses for airport infrastructure. It's impactful. It has effects on surrounding communities, particularly the airside. And the incubation period for major pieces of airport capital is very long. So Terminal 5 at Heathrow first appeared in an airport master plan in 1982. It opened 26 years later in 2008. So you got to get it right. And that's why airports, do master plans. There's a long and noble tradition of master plans, which I can claim to have written a few myself. But clearly, it's a function of the importance of capital to the airport business, and the fact that if you get it wrong, it's very difficult to make it right again. The other thing I talk about in the book is the concept of a pyramid of planning. And in a perfect world, an airport would have a series of tranches of planning that are all interlinked and aligned. So at the top, we would have a strategic plan with a horizon of 25 years, potentially, obviously refreshed more frequently than that. This is the province of the board of directors and the executive team. And it will basically say, this is the kind of airport we want to be. These are the strategic challenges and opportunities, and this is the airport that we want to be. Having done that, I think then you get into the master planning business, which is based on that strategy and the demand that is entailed by that strategy. This is what we think we need to build in terms of facilities, where, when, and how we deploy our land. In many cases, a master plan gets done without a strategy, which I think is a mistake. Having done a master plan, which typically has a 20-year horizon, you probably then do a series of 10-year plans that talk about the capital investments in some more detail, with more refined cost estimates, with which you secure funding. And then you get down to a multi-year operating plan, and then what we all know and love is the annual budget. So as I said, in theory, all these are aligned. In reality, that is often not the case. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is, let's just put it bluntly, corporate politics. New CEO comes in, new executive team comes in, they decide that they're going to change the strategic direction of the company, but there are pockets of resistance within the company that will fight that, with varying degrees of success. But the real reason, I think, in my view, is that often the strategy is far too ill-defined and woolly. So there's been a trend in strategic plans for airports where they have become opportunities for virtue signaling. By which I mean, you'll see airport strategic plans with the following terms, and we aim to be the best airport in the world. I've seen that. I've actually seen that. The best airport in the world. You will also see terms like, we want to be the greenest airport in Europe. We want to be the best employer in the Republic of Ireland. We want to offer the best customer service of any airport in North America. So these are noble statements, and indeed they might have some merit as communications devices, but they're not a strategy. A strategy is a unflinching assessment of the challenges and opportunities ahead of the airport, with concrete actions designed to seize the opportunities and repel the challenges. For example, one of the strategic challenges might be we can't get enough people skilled in data analysis. And that's particularly important now as we move into the realm of digital transformation. So what do we do to secure the appropriate human capital in the field of data analysis? Well, maybe we pay 25% more than the median salary in our labor catchment area. A tangible action goal to try and deal with a tangible challenge. Being the best employer in the Republic of Ireland is not necessarily going to be that helpful. And the problem with these, what I call virtue signaling kind of strategic statements, is that these are incredibly large and blank canvases that anybody can paint on. And conceivably, in the lower tranches of the pyramid, you can claim that what you're doing is actually consistent with the strategic plan. So the book spends some time talking about the importance of strategic clarity and honesty, because that is, in my view, a fundamental building block to having the subordinate plans integrated and aligned. So the other concept I raise, and this is not unique to aviation, you see trilemmas in other fields of study, economics most notably. But a trilemma is a situation where there are 3 desirable outcomes, but only 2 are realistically possible. And a lot of strategic plans fail to recognize that there is a trilemma. And you will see a strategic plan that says we want to be the best airport for our customers in North America. So we want to be good, offer a superior level of customer service. We want to be fast. We want to be really efficient. We want to get people from gate to curb and curb to gate as fast as possible. And we want to be cheap. We want to have unit operating costs in the bottom quintile of our peer airports. Well, pick 2. And just to illustrate the general point, FedEx, fast and good. They will get the package from A to B, and you'll know where it is along every inch of the way. Our national mail services, the Royal Mail in the UK, Canada Post here, they're good and cheap. It'll get there. It won't cost a lot. And then you have Mike's delivery service with his graffiti tagged van that will get the package from A to B, but there's no way you're going to track it. And God forbid that the recipient is not there when I deliver it, because you're going to have to come to my grotty depot in a remote industrial estate to pick it up. So most airports default to being fast and good. People who travel by air tend to be affluent, and they expect a good level of service, and they value their time. But in the book, there's an example of Austin Airport in Texas, which full service airport. They opened a low-cost terminal. And the problem they had was they kept having to ask their staff to take off their full service hats and put on their cheap and cheerful hats when they were dealing with the low-cost terminal. And that proved to be culturally very difficult. So they ended up contracting out the operation of the low-cost terminal to a cheap and cheerful provider to avoid that sort of strategic confusion, if you like. So recognizing that there are trilemmas, don't try and be the lowest cost airport when you're also trying to be the best, because that will inherently create some conflicts in the lower layers of the pyramid. The other thing I think is important in strategic planning is to identify the next inflection point. Inflection point in demand. I think if we arrayed on a virtual table at this webinar, 40 master plans from around the world, and we looked at the aviation forecast section, we'd see straight lines. And this is, I think, one of the distinguishing features about my book from maybe previous books on master planning is, I don't believe it's a linear process anymore. And I think the velocity and pace of change in technology and business models makes constant coefficients of demand not particularly helpful. So I think an important part of the strategic planning exercise and the forecasting exercise that falls out of that is to identify inflection points. And these can come from many things. These can come from changes in air carrier strategy. They can come from changes in government policy. Country A and country B negotiate an open skies agreement, and all of a sudden a lot more people are flying between A and B. Air traffic control rules like ETOPS, exchange rates for border airports, aircraft technology, look at Gander and Shannon, or they can be self-induced. An airport can say, okay, strategically, we think there's a niche we can exploit here, we're going to go for it. And they will hopefully see an inflection up in the demand for that particular product or line of business. So just to give you an example of this, let's take a look at Manchester Airport in the UK. And the red line is enplane, deplane passengers all the way back to 1975. And the blue bars are percentage change in passenger traffic in the previous 5 years. So in 1975, Manchester was doing about 3 million passengers. It was growing slowly. But then in the mid-80s, there was an inflection up. And what happened in Manchester in the mid-80s? Well, Manchester, as they called it, home of the new music scene, emerged with the seminal band, the Happy Mondays, in the top photograph there, leading the charge on that. So Manchester became a destination for people interested in music. Sir Alex Ferguson became the manager of Manchester United in 1986 and took Manchester United to European glory on several occasions. So a lot of travel between Manchester and points in Europe for local and visiting fans. But finally, the gentleman at the bottom, who you'll recognize as Michael O'Leary, the CEO of Ryanair, around the mid-1980s, Ryanair was just a scrappy little airline that started flying between the UK and Ireland for pennies compared to what the comfortable duopoly of Aer Lingus and British Airways were charging. And legend has it that they would recruit parish priests in the Irish neighborhoods in British cities and have them tell their parishioners that if you want to go back to the old country for a wedding or a funeral or a birthday party, you can now do so for £20 as opposed to £200. So this was a change in air carrier strategy. A new air carrier business model came into the market that arguably inflected the growth rate of Manchester Airport up. The other thing that happened around this time, of course, was that we all realized that these new jet engines were just so damn reliable. And we didn't have to hug the shoreline flying across large bodies of water. So ETOPS came into play. And all of a sudden, you could fly across the North Atlantic in a 2-engine aircraft, which made, secondary markets like Manchester to Toronto, Manchester to Boston viable. So all that's great. And then, just to reflect on some of the hazards of linear forecasting is that if you were the head of planning in Manchester Airport in 1975 or 1980, and you drew a straight line off that first curve, you'd say, well, in 2020, Manchester Airport will be serving 15 million passengers. If you were the head of planning at Manchester Airport around 2000, you said, well, if I extend this line, I will end up serving Manchester Airport will serve something in the order of 40 million passengers by 2020. So this is why it's important to go through a process to identify these inflection points. Then, of course, in 2010, Manchester Airport lost 5 million passengers, which was a huge number of passengers. And I'll be guided by the advice of my colleagues in the UK who may be close to this, but I think this is British Airways during the great financial crisis saying we can't afford to have a secondary hub at Manchester Airport. And we will retrench to Heathrow, which obviously put a huge hole in Manchester Airport's finances. Growth subsequently resumed. So I think what this illustrates is in terms of forecasting, it's less important to be right. And I think as a forecaster, probably the most liberating moment in my forecasting career was realizing I actually don't have to be right, but I do have to have a process in place that manages to capture all the potential factors that bear upon this airport's passenger demand. And these are some of the examples that I think you have to consider when you're doing forecasting. The other thing I think we need to acknowledge is there may well be a new normal. So the coefficient by which we translated a level of economic activity, GDP, into passenger demand, arguably has changed. And if we look at the 9 countries and the 9 airports that I work with at the Airport Benchmarking Group at Imperial College, what we see is an average reduction of 18% in the number of passengers at these airports relative to the size of their national economies. So this is the real change. There's a lot of conversation in our industry about, oh, we're 90% below pre-pandemic levels, we're 85%, we'll get to 100% of pre-pandemic levels by 2024. And they're important numbers because they obviously determine the number of bodies coming through the terminal building and therefore the resources and the staffing necessary. But the real number, I think, is interesting. Relative to the size of the economy, on average, we're consuming 18% less air travel than we were pre-pandemic. And the question is this a structural change because of virtual meetings, less business travel? Is it a structural change because of a hardening of social attitudes to air travel and the impacts it has on climate change? Or is it just a cyclical phase that we will get through because arguably air travel has not been a particularly pleasant experience over the last few years with poor on-time performance and lineups at security screening and immigration? People have maybe sort of avoided it. But I think this is an important thing to consider is I think the assumption we're going to go back to pre-pandemic coefficients of demand to economic activity needs to be tested. Okay, then we get into the master planning world, which is familiar to most people. I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but you do need a comprehensive evaluation criteria that covers the 4 pillars of sustainability: governance, economic, environmental, and social. Because what might appear to be the obvious solution or the best solution, sometimes it's not, and it bears scrutiny given, again, as I mentioned earlier, the longevity of capital and the long incubation periods it takes to deliver it. And we also find another trilemma in airport master planning, which I think it's important to be explicit about. And I'll just use the example of Vancouver Airport, the master plan for which I did in 2007. And there's beautiful Vancouver, BC, airport in the foreground. And we had concluded that we would need a new runway in the master planning time horizon. And we had 2 options. One was to build a long runway out in the blue estuary there to the left of the airport. And the other was to build a short, stubby runway to the south of the existing runway. I'm sorry, I don't have my pointer skills sufficiently sharp to illustrate that. But this was a classic trilemma. The runway, the foreshore runway, out on the water there to the west of the airport, very expensive, with significant environmental impacts on the aquatic habitat. But it was the quiet runway. It was the runway that was further away from residential communities than you could ever imagine, and therefore it could be run 24/7 without interfering with anybody's sleep. The inner south runway was exactly the opposite. Relatively cheap to build, very few environmental impacts, but it was closer to residential neighborhoods that were rapidly growing and developing into high density neighborhoods. So again, I think it's important in master planning to recognize that 2 out of 3 ain't bad, and be explicit about it as opposed to airbrushing it, and be conscious about the trade-offs that collectively the airport operator, the community it serves, the stakeholders, the business partners are making in deciding on a particular option. The other thing I think in terms of coefficients changing, not only between demand, not only between a certain level of economic activity and the demand for air travel, is how we translate that demand into facility requirements. Do not buy this book if you want to know how many meters should separate 2 Code C aircraft stands. Do not buy this book if you want to understand what is the capacity of a dependent dual runway system. This book, there are plenty of other books that do that very well. This is not the focus of this book. The focus of this book is to say, be aware of how the coefficient by which you translate demand into facilities has changed and will change. A lot of the master plans written in the last decade of the last century and the first decade of this century recommended a new runway, including the one I just mentioned at Vancouver. We were all surprised by just how another part of the ecosystem, the air carriers, deployed bigger planes and put more bums in seats on them. So this is for US carriers. This is the left-hand graph. US carriers, average load factor goes from slightly below 70% in 1995 to 85% just before the pandemic. But the upgauging was substantial, from 165 seats to 180 seats, give or take. So the ability of another part of the ecosystem to respond to capacity constraints in another part of the ecosystem, airport runways, I think took a lot of people by surprise. The other thing that I think is a good example here is, again, airport master plans done in that period, and airport terminals that were built or planned and designed in that period often had these massive vaulted check-in halls, right? Hong Kong, Pearson Terminal 1, Heathrow Terminal 2. Because the assumption was that most people would still check in at the airport. Well, I think very few people actually check in at the airport. They might drop their bags there, of course, but the actual check-in process, I think, has gone on online. And in fact, a major US airport of my acquaintance is planning a new terminal building with no check-in counters in it. Well, maybe a few for the exception transactions. But again, I think one of the things we need to do in master planning is move away from this assumption that there's a constant coefficient that translates demand into capacity, and think about what technologies are just emerging that could cause our assumption about how much space we need to provide for this particular function to change in 10, 20 years' time. And of course, digital transformation is well underway, and that I think is going to profoundly affect how much capacity we need to provide in the traditional sense relative to a certain level of demand. In some areas it might go up, in some areas it might go down. But again, to be alive to the possibility that the coefficient is going to change. The other thing so having done a chapter on the importance of strategic clarity and honesty, the importance of demand forecasting, considering inflection points, the importance of assuming the coefficients that translate demand into capacity can change. I then talk about air cargo, and very, very encouraged to see that the EAC conference in Luxembourg is focusing on this, because air cargo has traditionally been a sort of forgotten part of the airport business. It's processed in remote sheds at night. It doesn't send emails complaining about washrooms. It doesn't post photographs of lineups at security to to Twitter. But arguably, it saved a lot of airports bacon during the pandemic, and has continued to show robust growth. So this chart just shows three lines. The black line, the black solid line at the bottom, is an exchange traded fund called JETS. You can buy it from your stockbroker. And it's a basket of companies in air transport, air carriers, airports. I think they might have an air traffic control company or two in there. They've got, some of the big equipment providers, I think like Vanderlande and those kind of companies. And all this is indexed back to 2019 at 100. And you can see the pandemic there in March 2020, and it's bounced along, but it arguably hasn't recovered that much, actually. So this is kind of like a collective valuation of the air transport industry globally. But the black dotted line is a basket of companies in the air freight and logistics business. So FedEx, UPS, DHL, some of the big freight forwarders like Kuehne and Nagel, and they have done very well. And you can see at the peak there, that's probably in the depth of the pandemic when we were shipping PPE and vaccines around the world, and supply chains were under stress. So people were putting just-in-time material on express air freight services. That's done very well. And the small dotted line is corporate aviation, similarly a basket of corporate aviation companies. Both have done extremely well. And I think airports that have traditionally not spent a lot of time thinking about air cargo and corporate aviation probably need to do so. The corporate aviation story, I think, is quite interesting, and I'd be grateful for other views on this. But so there's Mike Brown. Mike Brown is the CEO of Mike Brown Brewing Company, and he wants to take his four VPs to look at a brewery in, I don't know, Asheville, North Carolina, that they're contemplating buying. Well, we could all pile on Delta from Toronto to Atlanta and connect to Asheville or through another U.S. hub, but that has some risk associated with it in terms of misconnections and all the challenges that aviation has faced in the last few years. Or we could just hop on a corporate jet, fly there, kick the tires at the brewery, and come home. And on the way, we'll chat about other business. So interesting to see where that goes. And obviously, in terms of runway efficiency, it's probably not a helpful development because these are small aircraft. But I think these are areas that airports need to focus on that hitherto have not been given a lot of attention. Just to conclude with a comment from a guy who knows a little bit about technology and a bit about making money too. Bill Gates' quote is, "We always overestimate the change that will happen in the next 2 years and underestimate the change that will happen in the next 10. And I think what Bill is saying here is you got to think about S-curves. You got to think about inflection points where suddenly the take-up, the demand, the adoption rate dramatically increases. And I suspect this was, the case that we saw in terms of online check-in. I'm sure when the terminal planners were at work, a few brave souls were checking in online, but nobody fully comprehended just how common and ubiquitous that would become. So I think that's a good quote to bear in mind when we're sort of planning ahead in terms of airport capital. I then talk about airport area planning. So, we all know that airports have big catalytic economic impacts. We'll talk about that in a minute. But I have done a lot of work in several cities that shows that proximity to an airport gets capitalized into commercial property values. So what explains the value of an office in, say, Hammersmith in West London? Well, the main things that explain the value of a property in Hammersmith, West London, are how old is it, how big is it, and what quality of office spaces. Is it Class A or is it Class C? But when you introduce a variable or variables to measure proximity to Heathrow, in terms of time on the tube, in terms of just distance by road, it turns out to be significant. It's not the main variable, but it's significant. And also, when there are improvements in accessibility to the airport, such as a new line like the Elizabeth line in London, you will similarly see an uptick in office value, independent of other factors. To me, this says that airports and the regions around them have to plan together. And historically, that has not been the case. The airport has a master plan cycle. They will do a master plan. The region, the surrounding region municipalities have their own official community planning cycle. But there's really no reason for these two documents not to talk. And I think the value in that is that it's a win-win. I don't believe a lot of municipalities around airports fully appreciate just how the airport impacts the value of land and therefore how you plan for land use. Or if they do, it's a notion. It's a notion as opposed to rooted in hard data. But I think this opportunity to integrate planning, and I know that's a bit of a motherhood statement. Planners like to talk about integrated plans. But I think in this case, there is some merit because of the infrastructure that is inherent in serving not only the airport, but the broader airport economic zone is of common interest. And the fact that the better the airport is connected to the world, and the better the airport is connected to the surrounding region, results in an uptick in values. And that has to be considered, I think, to produce effective airport plans and airport area plans. So we're almost there, folks. Thanks for sticking with me. I think we'll have some time for questions too. I then have a chapter on economic impact. Every airport worth its salt has an economic impact statement that will say something like there are 50,000 direct jobs associated with the ongoing operation of this airport. There's another 50,000 indirect and induced jobs, and all this activity generates Y in GDP and X in taxes. And this is greeted with a collective yawn, in my opinion, because everybody's got an economic impact statement. Every investment, every business proposition has got an economic impact statement. And unfortunately, in my view, airports' economic impact statements in the traditional form get drowned out by all the other noise. So what I suggest in this chapter is a number of ways to break through that noise. Firstly, don't say, my airport produces, the taxes yielded by ongoing operations of my airport produces a tax haul for all governments of $150 million per year. What you say is the taxes that this airport spins off pays for 5 local hospitals for 6 months. Or you say the municipal taxes that this airport spins off pays for all the soccer pitches in Hounslow. Put it in context, particularly for politicians. I think also we need to move from numbers to narratives. So here's a box of Atlantic Canada lobster, which is exported in great quantities to China by virtue of the fact there's nonstop service between Toronto Pearson and Beijing, and it's easy to connect to those flights from Atlantic Canada. And according to legends, the Atlantic Canada Fishermen's Association has a better idea of the cadence of state banquets in Beijing than MI6 and the CIA and CSIS, because they get the orders. That might just be an urban legend, but it's an interesting point, right? Secondly, so tell the story about how exporters are able to access new markets by virtue of the connectivity. and the facilities available at the airport. Secondly, more of a focus on job quality than quantity. 50,000 jobs, great, but actually with concern about the gig economy, with concern about minimum living wage. Another story to tell is the quality of the jobs at the airport. Another angle is enabling innovation. If you look at US patent awards, which arguably are the sort of bellwether of innovation, and everybody applies for a US patent, regardless of where they are in the world, you will see that most patents are awarded to multinational teams that have worked for many years on this new drug, this new piece of machinery, this new engine, whatever it is. And all that has relied on air travel. So there's a great story to be told there. And finally, in the words of Tip O'Neill, the former Speaker of the US House of Representatives, whose legendary remark was, "All politics is local." What I suggest, and I give some examples in the book, is how you pass the 50,000 jobs into jobs in the geography that matters most to elected representatives, namely their riding, as we call them in Canada, their constituencies, you call them in the UK, their congressional district, as you call them in the US, and customize for each local politician exactly what the airport means for his or her voters. So that's some thoughts on economic impact there that I think I hope will be helpful. Finally, I end with a lesson from history, and they say history doesn't repeat itself, but it sometimes rhymes. The thing I noticed as I was writing the book was we haven't had a pandemic, right? And so I wrote the book during the pandemic, and I was curious about the last pandemic, which was the 1918 Spanish flu, which actually killed proportionally a lot more people than COVID did, obviously because medical science was not as advanced as it was back then, as it is now. And of course, the other thing about the Spanish flu was it tended to kill young, healthy people. Nonetheless, the history lesson is that the dominant mode of intercity transportation in Canada, and I'm sure the same is true in the US and Europe, it never recovered from the last pandemic. So in the 5 years leading up to 1918, the Canadian railways certainly had their best 5 years ever. Just like the Canadian airports had their best 5 years up to 2019, even allowing for the fact that there was a world war raging. By 1938, 20 years later, the Canadian railways were serving half the passengers they served in 1918. And I continue to research this as a matter of just personal interest. But this disruptive little technology called the automobile came along. And politicians, seeing how many of their voters were buying these newfangled automobiles, said, we better pave some roads. There were some major economic events, obviously, during this period, like the Great Depression. But the story, and I use this with my airport colleagues and clients, is that the railway industry was complacent. It assumed that once we got through the Spanish flu, it'll be back to normal. And if you look at a Canadian railway timetable from the 1930s, you will see, there's one train a day between Toronto, where I am, and Kingston, Ontario, a university town, about 3 hours east. And it stopped at every farm gate. So just to be clear, I'm not predicting that the fate of air transportation after COVID will track the fate of the railways in Canada, and indeed most of the developed world, I suspect, after COVID, after the Spanish flu. But I do use it to impress upon my colleagues in the airport business. Don't assume it's all going to come back. Don't assume we just wait this out and then we go back to business as usual. I think that would be a dangerous assumption, and the need for innovation and fresh thinking and creativity is going to be important. One of the taglines we came up with at Imperial College, working with our 9 global hub airports, is airports will have to come back cleaner, greener, leaner, and keener. The cleaner is obviously public expectations of cleanliness and crowding have changed fundamentally. The leaner is margins are getting squeezed. The traditional sources of non-aeronautical revenues for airports, parking, retail, duty-free, car rental, they're all being disrupted in various ways. The greener is clearly, talking about getting to net zero. And the keener is, again, talking about some of the themes I mentioned on the economic impact slide, about being more engaged in the quality of jobs as opposed to the quantity of jobs, more engaged in the public health, well-being of the communities they serve. So thank you for hanging in. It's now 45 minutes after the hour. Unlike my co-authors or my fellow authors, I am not offering a price discount because my comprehensive econometric analysis revealed that the demand for the book is inelastic. But what I am going to offer you is a value proposition that I think is even better. One is 15% of the royalties from the book, which admittedly is not a lot of money, as we all know, but I do this with all my consulting and speaking revenue, goes to bursaries for students in aviation. And I just gave $5,000 to the British Columbia Aviation Council out in Vancouver, BC, based on this model. And the other thing I'm happy to offer is a complimentary virtual, or if you're located in a particularly desirable location, I'll actually come and visit you, guest lecture to your students. So with that, thank you for your attention, and happy to take any questions.
Yeah, Mike, thank you very much. This was extremely interesting. So I won't ask the first question because then I give the others time to think about whether they have some other questions. So it is my feeling that strategic planning could be very different depending on where you look at it globally. So in Asian countries, specifically China, maybe it's very different from Western countries. Could you perhaps share a little bit your experiences with the differences in strategic planning, depending on whether we are talking about, let's say, China or US, Europe?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question, Akeem. Thanks. I think probably more important is the governance model of the airport, in the sense that I think public sector airports, so airports that are run by an arm of government, will tend to have a different set of strategic priorities than a fully private, for-profit shareholder airport like a London Heathrow. So I think that's probably the more important difference. But I take your point that there might be a cultural overlay or a geographical overlay to that too. I think the other sort of thing that you might find as a variant, if you like, in strategic plans is the level of economic development. So we all know that countries that have per capita incomes of somewhere between 5,000 and 15,000 US. So, for example, that would include Vietnam, Indonesia. The propensity for air travel grows very rapidly between those two figures. So if you're in a fast-growing market, you will probably have a different strategic plan than if you're in a mature market like Germany or Canada. But I think it's a good point. There are a number of flavors of strategy. I would argue that I would argue that a strategic plan is important in all cases. But it's an interesting point you raised, that there might indeed be geographical differences as well as governance and economic development, stage of economic development differences too.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you. Shall I? There are two comments in the chat. Shall I maybe just mention them, or?
Sure. Yeah.
All right. So Noel has a point. He kind of highlighted that this economic impact messaging, that he really thinks that's a very good point. David Starkey was just posting a message. David, if you want to maybe unmute your mic, you're welcome to just ask the question directly yourself. Otherwise, I would be just reading it.
Okay, Mike, you put a lot of emphasis on inflection points, and a very good point too, I think. But my query, slightly tongue-in-cheek, is if you're doing forecast predictions for a master plan, how do you predict your inflection points?
Well, it's a great question, David, and it's one that bedevils sort of forecasters everywhere. I mean, I think you need to create a series of scenarios. So my thought is you go through a process to identify potential inflection points, as I listed, though there may well be others. Then I think, you obviously quantify what that impact might be. I suspect what you do is then you say, well, we think the probability of this happening in the next, X years is Y, and you come up with a bit of a sort of risk reward, risk for the downside inflection points and reward for the upside inflection points. So I think you create a funnel of potential traffic outcomes. There are more sophisticated ways, and I do make reference in the book to some fairly sophisticated probabilistic methods of doing this, which gives you sort of 5,000 lines of forecast, and you create a funnel through. Probably too much for most airports to deal with. But I think you have to go through a process of assigning a probability to the inflection point, and create a range of forecasts around it.
There is another question, or another kind of common question from Hans Martin.
Yes.
And this is about white elephant airports. So I think this raises the question: do you think that there are lots of white elephant airports? And if so, is this a planning mistake, market failure, or policy failure? So, but I think my first question would be: do you think there are lots of airports around that are not needed or have way too much capacity than justified by their demand or future demand?
Well, it's a fascinating question, and there's a bit of a sort of counterfactual here. I think if we said, let's take a map of Europe and a map of North America and a map of anywhere, and said, if we had to plan an airport system today, how different would it be from the airport system we have? And certainly in Canada, which I know the best, obviously, the airport system we have is a legacy of an era when planes couldn't fly that far, when planes had trouble, when air navigation technology was primitive, when you had to have sort of 6 runways because the aircraft couldn't take a crosswind of anything more than a sort of puff of air. So I suspect we're over airported. Certainly in the developed world, I suspect we're over airported, which is why I think you see a lot of, certainly in the UK and Europe, where you've got a legacy of not only past aircraft air navigation technology, but the Cold War. But remarkably, airports keep operating. There's a niche. There's an airport in the west of Ireland. I understand that only opens for 8 hours a day because they can run it with one shift as opposed to 2 shifts. So I think we've been quite creative about how we've used arguably more, the more airport capacity that we have that we actually need, as opposed to white elephants. I don't know. I think sometimes there are deep strategic reasons for airports to be built that maybe under the radar to the conventional, rationale for building an airport. That have a sort of quasi-military or agenda that we're not quite sure about. But I think new build white elephant airports are hopefully comparatively rare, or if they're not, that the mistake will be revealed sooner rather than later. But yes, I think we're over airported in general. Would be my comment based on what we have today in terms of technology, ground catchment, and
but I would say the way you explained it, it's not necessarily policy failure. It's what you, again, in the very beginning, you mentioned this, like, okay, you build an airport and it's there forever, right? And then technology is changing, and then maybe an airport that you have needed at some point in time is not required anymore because of technological developments. So that, that is perhaps not necessarily failure. The failure could perhaps be just maintaining and keep operating the airport, although perhaps closing it down may be a better option. I don't know. Do you see like a big issue with policy failure or so?
I don't think so. I mean, look at Shannon, right? Shannon Airport continues to prosper through the good offices of the people running Shannon Airport, their ingenuity, their innovation. So there's just the sheer sort of determination to make the airport a going concern, which we have to acknowledge and celebrate, I guess. And I think closing airports, there might be a case study on that, but very difficult to close an airport because to actually repurpose it for something useful will take a lot of money, right? Digging up runways and pulling out fuel tanks and remediating 50 years of environmental damage. So that's not an easy thing to do. And then communities, and I guess we talk about, I guess this is the flip side of the economic impact argument. We've been actually so successful in persuading communities that airports have a positive economic impact that closing them is very much like a community sort of shutting down its train station, or putting concrete barricades on the highway that connects it to the autobahn or the autostrada that takes it to the rest of the world. So I think it's very difficult to close an airport for all those reasons, which is probably why we haven't seen a lot of airports close over the last few years.
I think Milan Janic, did you have a comment or question?
Yes, this is you can't see me. Last time I didn't repair my camera so you can't see me. But the question is about let's say inflection points. Could they be considered by analyzing the driving forces of demand? That's first. Second, pointing out that airports are actually passive infrastructure. Their development depends on the airlines. What airlines are going to do and how they are going to operate and see their potential for flying somewhere, because particularly in Eastern Europe, you can see some airports with very low traffic because simply airlines decide to abandon their flights. That's first. And probably second, I would ask about your opinion about constraining airport growth. You have constrained Gatwick in UK, you have constrained Heathrow, now Schiphol Amsterdam will be constrained because of environmental issues and so on. How would you comment, or how can you comment on this?
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. Clearly, I think in the examples, well, the example I gave of Manchester and other airports I've looked at, a change in air carrier strategy can be a significant inflection point, both good and bad. You know, the example of Manchester, the shuttering of the BA hub. If you look at Cincinnati in the US, Delta decided to close Cincinnati as a hub, and they went from 22 million passengers a year to 7 million passengers in about 5 years. So, you know, when we think about the ecosystem, the actions of one part of the ecosystem can be dramatically bad for another part. On the other hand, when an airport attracts a low-cost carrier, for example, they can see a boom in traffic. So air carrier strategy, I think, is one of the more important of the inflection points, and probably one of the inflection points with the greatest amplitude. I think that's the term we use for measuring sort of peak to trough. And it behooves airports to be very close to their airline business partners and to be monitoring the business models that are emerging and dying in the air carrier industry, and assessing their vulnerability to those changes, and also the opportunity where it exists. The caps on growth, I think, are very interesting, and you're right to mention Schiphol. I think, like, I wouldn't want to comment too much on that, other than to say, I think this is a reflection of concern, broadly speaking, about the environmental and indeed the social impact of aviation, that airports need to quickly and effectively respond to. And certainly all the airports I work with are committed to net zero. I think that's actually standard these days. I think we can debate. I think there's room for debate about the manner in which the capacity is imposed, the capacity limit is imposed. You know, one model is to just say you can't have any more than X thousand flights per year. The other model is to say, well, here's a carbon and a noise budget, and provided you stay within this, you know, you will continue to have the license to operate. So I think there's two issues there. One is the manner in which the capacity constraint is imposed, and also the imperative for airports to make sure that they are aligned with social and community views, and stay ahead of the curve, so to speak.
There is another question by Phil Potterton. It's great, Phil, that you're here now.
Thanks, Achim, and thank you for your helping me to be part of this process. Yes, Mike, I was very interested in your comments about corporate aviation and the uptick in that.
Mm-hmm.
We're in the middle of a white paper process in Australia, and the green paper that came out a couple of months ago, it actually talked about the potential for potentially electric aircraft in the short distance area. I mean, it wasn't specific,
Yep.
but obviously people are talking about perhaps 9 to 15 seats, those sorts of planes, and I guess they look I mean, the issue that can tap into in this country is because we're a country of sort of vast cities and then very small places around them. We've got all of these fairly uneconomic air routes and places without, similarly, even less economic train services. So in a sense, the sort of micro mobility type sort of idea does look like an interesting opportunity if it's there. I think the green paper said, well, we probably won't see anything for 20 to 25 years. Perhaps that's a little conservative, but I'm just interested in, I suppose, I mean, obviously this is, you've talked about the coefficients so I suppose I'm interested if you've got thoughts about that area as a potential disruptor and what it might mean for airport design. You also said, well, of course, small planes aren't a very good user of runway capacity, and certainly our major capital city area, you sort of think, well, how could they ever really get into our major capital city airports, because they're all very much at capacity, at least in the ones that are close to the center where people want to be. So that was really, as I say, your thoughts in that area.
No, thanks, Phil. I think our industry has the capacity to always surprise us. And just before I talk about aircraft specifically, there is an airport in the United States where they now have a private hold room. You can book your own hold room for you and your mates, and at a substantial cost, but you'll get screened privately by TSA, and then you're driven to your plane, your commercial plane, in a limo. And nobody thought, really? So we're going to have these sort of individual boutique hold rooms, and I don't know if it takes off. I don't know if there's a mid-market there, but I think, again, to my last point on the history lesson is we should be alive to the innovation that is coming, and that has to sort of be considered in our plans. I think in terms of, clearly, battery powered short haul aircraft seem to be viable. There's an airline based in Vancouver, BC, called Harbour Air that flies seaplanes, and BC is unique because it's got a lot of bodies of water, and the major capital city politically and commercially is separate. So short haul is certainly possible with battery powered aircraft. To me, and then we got into these to eVTOLs, these emerging technologies. To me, the key question is, what is the cost per passenger mile? So when we look at an eVTOL, and I do not claim any expertise in this, but what I do see is a very, very sophisticated piece of equipment with at least one, if not two pilots in initially, and maybe 6 seats, flying a short distance. And so my question is, I would want to understand the cost per passenger kilometer of using that as a form of transportation. And then I think we'll get a good sense of, is this a goer, right? Or is it not? Certainly the challenge with corporate aircraft is on the emissions front. It's very bad, right? It's like, 5 people, Mike Brown and his 3 VPs going to see the brewery in Asheville. That's a pretty big carbon footprint. And I suspect, just like people are experimenting with supersonic aircraft now for corporate aircraft, I suspect corporate aircraft is sort of like the proving ground, if you like, for some of these new technologies. So I think an electric corporate aircraft, given that there are range concerns, maybe it's a hybrid, I don't know, because all companies are driving to net zero. And therefore a more efficient, meaning a corporate aircraft that emits less emissions, I think would be quite an attractive prospect. Might be the first place you see it. But I think it all comes back to the economics of the machine itself. And I'd be interested to see it as the eVTOL, as the eVTOLs become developed and prototypes start flying, what is the actual cost going to be? Because I think that's going to be ultimately the deciding factor on whether it's part of our future or not.
Thank you for that.
So, Mike, what do you think? Shall we finish the session?
Well, it's been tremendous fun. Thanks very much, everybody. And let me know if you'd like to take advantage of the offer of a free lecture.